How's it going, guys? Julian Bradley here. Now in today's video I've taken some audio from my live stream that I did this Monday and I've compiled the best answers that I gave to your ear training questions. So the whole hour we dedicated to ear training questions live, and I just went through people's questions and I answered, what's the best type of music to practice on? How do you get good at identifying chords by ear? And some of the answers might surprise you. There's some unusual practice techniques. Now just bear in mind that my whole ear training philosophy is based on learning to play every song in the same key. I transcribe in C minor, E flat major, so a lot of my answers are talking about the key of C minor. But let me know what you think in the comments below. We're going to get straight in now, and I'd love to see you this Monday, 10 a.m. Pacific, for another session of Monday Morning Live. So Kerry's asking, why do I tend to call my key C minor instead of its related name of E flat major? Okay, so I could talk about this one for a while, but I think more in terms of the minor scale more than the relative major scale. There is a reason for this, which is that when I'm looking at the piano keyboard, I like to view everything from the bottom note going up to the right, so that I can see everything above the note of C if we're in our key of C minor. And if you try it the other way, if you try thinking in terms of the relative major scale, which is E flat major, and let's say you're thinking everything ascending, which is natural for musicians. When you're thinking of harmony, you start with the bass note and then you think upwards to all the other rest of the notes and the chords. Well, if you have to then switch direction and go from E flat major and you have to recall what the relative minor is, then you have to switch direction to thinking downwards. You have to go down a minor third to find the C. And I just find it's much easier to just think in the minor scale, and then you can always see the relative major scale a minor third above the minor root note. So I find it much more efficient to just go with the lowest note in the harmony of the minor root note, and then you can see everything going on above you on the right of the keyboard, and you can always see the relative major scale, which is just above you. What should you visualize in your mind when you transcribe? The staff, the keyboard, my fretboard, numbers, arrows, what? That's a great question, Carlos. Certainly not staff paper. What I visualize is the piano keyboard, and in my mind it's a sort of 3D image with, the black notes are higher up and the white notes are lower down, and I visualize myself playing every note. In fact, when I first started transcribing songs by ear, I found myself sort of playing air piano a lot, like air guitar but air piano. And that was a habit I had to sort of learn not to do in public, but that's kind of what I do. I often feel myself playing with my fingers the notes, and I'm certainly visualizing the piano keyboard. So to sing a bass line, okay, so to transcribe bass lines, first thing is to make sure you're listening to music on good speakers or good headphones where you can hear the bass line clearly, not laptop speakers, not phone speakers. And then bass line, in some ways it's simpler than a melody because there's less notes. Usually there'll just be, say if you have a 4-chord progression, then there'll be 4 bass notes. It's more a case of learning the common patterns, and really it's related to the common chord progressions, because the way you identify chords by ear is by transcribing the bass line. So the common chord progressions are also common bass line patterns. So really it's a case of doing the main exercise which I've talked about today, which is reharmonizing melodies using chords within the key. And it's going to be the 7 chords that you find within C minor scale. 3 of those chords are major, 3 of those chords are minor, and I'd ignore the 2 chord, which is D diminished, because that rarely gets used. So start by composing your own chord progressions and playing the root of the chord in the bass line, and pay more attention to the bass line patterns than the chords above. So that would be my advice to help with bass lines, sorry. Do you have any beginner songs to transcribe? I would recommend Christmas songs, certainly because it's the time of year right now. That's what I started on. Basically, diatonic music is where you want to start. Pop songs. Electronic music is very clear to hear. I learnt a lot in the early days just from listening to electronic dance music at age 17, and sort of the more electronic produced songs are very clear to hear the bass line, the piano chords, and the melody, and it's just produced very clearly, so it's easier to sort of hear the notes compared to, say, guitar-based music, where It can be quite, strummy. The chords are voiced as power chords often where there's no third played. So generally I'd encourage you to stick with diatonic music, electronic sort of pop music, if you're okay with that, and just generally simple melodies like Christmas songs or children's songs. I can't recognize chord progressions, only the melody part. What should I practice? So the best thing to practice for chords is to reharmonize the melodies that you've already transcribed, and you should practice reharmonizing or creating a remix of a melody, because that's really how you learn how chords work, is by composition. When there's just 6 chords that get used for most diatonic music, I'm talking about 95% of diatonic music, there's really only a limited number of patterns that you can get. And certain patterns sound better than others, so they get used a lot of the time. And what you shouldn't do with learning to play chords is focusing on what a lot of my music education focused on, which was just playing isolated major and minor chords on the piano without any musical context. And that's kind of the reason why I'm not a fan of most ear training apps, is it's usually, from what I've seen, it's removed from any musical context. So try to practice ear training on real music. I learned to play music by ear on real music. Beethoven learned to play music by ear on real music. Miles Davis on real music. None of us had apps. And try to stay away from anything that's removed from real music, where it's just chords or intervals in isolation. So John Cook asks, when you hear a melody and recognize the tonic, do you treat that as a C note and then notate the melody in C, even though the melody may actually be in another key? Yes, I'm not bothered with what key the actual original is in. It has to be in one of the 12 keys, but apart from that, it doesn't really matter. I mean, the key to me is just an interval pattern. It's not like there's 12 different keys to me. To me, there's just one key, and we can rebuild that interval pattern from any of the 12 notes. So yes, when I hear a melody, and if I recognize the tonic, then I assume that that is C, even though I know if I tried it out at the piano, it probably wouldn't be a C. Alan Philippe says, I can recognize solfege notes fairly well in an isolated context, single melody, but when there's an underlying harmony, it gets more difficult. Any tips? Should we have the tonic in mind all the time? I'm not someone who listens to music trying to hear the tonic all the time. That's never been something I do. Isolated context, so that means playing notes on a piano without any harmony. This comes back to my whole, this is like the cause of most sort of misconceptions and like ineffective teaching methods, is when people have you transcribe outside a context of real music. For example, just playing a melody on its own without chords, or just playing an interval on its own without chords, or just playing like a single chord. All of these practice things, that it just doesn't bear any resemblance to actual transcribing. So that's why I'm all about learning to transcribe on real music. So just listen to your favorite music and to practice on that rather than doing the isolated stuff, which a lot of, say, apps do. They just play an interval on its own outside any context. So I would really encourage you to just do all of your practice on real music and to stay away from anything that's, just a single isolated chord or interval or melody. That stuff, I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's not very effective because it's a very different thing to actually listening to real music. Tips for transcription without the use of an instrument. So I always, recommend that you work towards transcribing away from your instrument, so you do it all in your head. That's not necessarily the very first step. If you're really new to this, it sort of depends what stage you're at with your instrument, but if that's too much to ask to begin with, then do your first 10 melodies using your instrument just to get the ball rolling. Once you start getting the hang of it, you want to start doing it without your instrument. Main tips for transcribing without your instrument would be listen to the song as many times as you need, and I would listen to at least the first 3 or 4 intervals, try to figure out the first few intervals of the melody, and then I would look at the notes of C minor scale, if that's your key, and I'd figure out where do those intervals fit within that key, because if you have a half step in your melody, for example, well, that instantly narrows down where the melody could be. It can't be C to D anymore, because it would be C to D flat, and that would take you out of key. It can't be F to G, it can't be all of these different places. It can only be 2 places, which are D and E flat, or G and A flat. So I would start by using that approach, try to identify a few intervals in a row, and then scan the notes of the scale to see where those intervals fit. And if you want more information on ear training, you can look at some of my recent everyday ear training videos on YouTube. And you could go to themusical.ear.com where I've got my free ear training video series. I've also got a new series of email tips, which is a 10-week weekly email system where it sends you these challenges. Those are over at themusical.ear.com. But I hope you have a great day, and thank you so much for being here.